So I started this video in a portrait thinking I want to post something just really quick on the social networking platforms with regard to this, but then I quickly turned the video to landscape and decided that I think these words perhaps might be of value and I think are important to bring to the forefront for anyone who is, for example, using programs with me, works closely with me, or just uses some resources, or even if you're just working on your own physical practice on your own terms. The idea is related to how long it takes. And as much as we might like to think that we soften ourselves to this idea of making very fast progress, and we understand that it's all about the process, and we understand that, we can't just keep working towards a specific goal because it's never linear, it's always up and down, and this is the flow of life. We can understand all of this, and yet we always still ask the question, man, why is this taking so long? And what I would personally say with this is that when this comes into the mind, and I think for many practitioners in their early stages of practice, or perhaps have just been only involved with practices that are very specifically oriented towards this idea, for example, competitive practices, or certain areas of physical practice in which the goals of those things not very clear, like fitness as an objective. What this means when this question is still in the mind is that the full appreciation of what a practice is and what a true practice brings you has not yet been realized. And of course, it cannot be realized, and this is kind of the paradox, we cannot fully realize what an invested practice can bring us until we have truly spent the time practicing. And that brings us to the question then that pops up for those who perhaps have not really spent that invested time practicing, like, how long is that? What is that time span I'm thinking about? And so as much as I'm reluctant to always give these in measurable terms, because I think it's kind of contributing to the perspective that we're trying to move away from, or this inquiry that we're trying to move away from, how long does it take? If you're thinking about, let's start really simply, capacity development, mobility development, the remodeling of your physical constitution, how long does this take? Well, I've said this elsewhere, and I like to quote it just because it's been thrown around and out there quite clearly by a popular gymnastics coach, Christopher Summer, who would say it takes about 7 to 9 months for a first cycle of adaptation to occur in the musculoskeletal tissues, from which point an ongoing development of mobility capacities is continue to grow. So what that basically means, in clear terms, is that if you haven't been practicing those protocols consistently for 7 to 9 months, it's pretty much useless for you even to put in your mind the question of how long this is taking. That's the fact. Strength development is similar, but perhaps slightly different. We can observe that, in the novice strength enthusiast that is coming to a program anew, again, you look at the most popular strength coaches, people such as Dan John or Mark Rippetoe and stuff like this, and they'll all say that, you can give a novice anything. 10 push-ups a day, 10 pull-ups a day, or 10 push-ups and 1 pull-up, or, run 500 meters and then do 50 squats, and whatever it is. You can do these things, and you're going to make consistent progress. That's why there are so many programs out there that say, this is the one program that makes progress for everyone. Because it does, when you're a beginner, and for about the first 6 weeks. And then you need to start either changing it, or ultimately, to make long-term progress as part of a practice, have a consistent practice that is consistently invested in, not over the months, not over a year, not over perhaps just years, but 5 years, 8 years, a decade. So this brings us to what I really want to share, which is, how long does it take to establish a practice? And I'll start putting this into measurable terms. Whatever practice it is, we can just completely generalize. Are you learning to play a guitar? Are you learning to, building a movement practice? Are you learning to play football? Are you learning to swim? Are you learning how to play chess? Are you learning how to write a fantastic poem? Whatever it is. If you speak to anyone who is proficient in those fields, I have in many cases spoke with individuals in these particular places, it's going to be, a year investment in those areas. You're still really, really going to be a beginner. And of course, we're always beginners and we're always learning, but I'm talking about actually learning about what this thing is. I had to go to boxing or capoeira and things like this. For me, the 1 year, unless I've spent 1 year there, I can't even say, from any place that I feel secure, that I have a little bit of experience, I've dabbled in that. If you've done something like, I don't know, kickboxing for 6 months, I can't really consider how that could be an invested practice for 6 months. All that really says is that actually you could not stick to a practice because you only spent 6 months in this practice. So the idea, I think, of about 3 years. 3 years is a good place to say, yeah, I've got a bit of experience there. 1 year is I know something a little bit about it from the sidelines. 3 years is, okay, yeah, I have a bit of experience here and some understanding. 5 years is where we get to the point where it's like, okay, I have an embodied understanding here, an embodied understanding through my practice, and now I can begin to bring to this place some ideas of my own that I think have some contribution because of my personal experiences. And this, for me, is when we get to the level of an invested practitioner that then has something to give back. Please don't forget that I'm just saying these numbers just as a point because some people really need some measurable ideas, like, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years and stuff like this. Ultimately, it just becomes arbitrary because if you're a practitioner in something, or if you're just generally a practitioner, you practice stuff, like that's you're a practitioner for life, right? And you stop asking these questions because ultimately they're just blockages to you from moving forward. They are products of doubt. Not even just in the method that you're using, but doubt in yourself because you've perhaps never actually had an invested practice before. Generally, most of the people who I work with who do not ever ask these questions, or it doesn't even concern to them how long something or, when it happens or what it takes, they're people who are either at a stage in their life in which, in the general experience of life, they've noticed that, asking this question is not the best thing. Or they've come from a physical practice in which they've already invested like 3, 5, 8, 10 years or more. And they completely understand that, this is just the way that it is. And when I offer them advice like this, they're like, no, look, I've done this already in like a different thing. I know the practice part of it. You don't need to introduce that to me. But very commonly it can pop up through physical practice because the most popular, and this comes to the cultural aspect of physical practice, the most popular aspect that we're familiar with is, for example, the fitness industry. And the fitness industry is a commodity industry, which essentially means it's related to selling stuff. And when you're related to selling stuff, you need to keep up a certain outgoing of product, and you need a certain, people returning in order to generate consistent revenue, right? So the idea of practice isn't a great business model, which is why, for example, fitness industries and gyms and stuff like this, they're making tons and tons and tons of money, whereas people who work in practices, like very often, like, a studio where they're teaching a martial art, or a dance or something like this, or, a chess club or a guitar teacher. Normally these people, unless they have a significant name for themselves by effort of their work, but sometimes it's not even that, unless they have a name for themselves, they're normally not making a lot of money. And that's just the reality of it. But, these people are teachers. And when you teach someone something, the ultimate idea is to empower, and necessarily when you empower somebody, it means that they don't need the teacher anymore for their own individual journey at some point, unless they want to learn more from that particular teacher's experience, because the teacher always has more to share. It's inexhaustible, right? but it just depends what the practitioner wants to keep extracting from that teacher. So it's a little bit of a rant, but it kind of is, because it pops up again and again and again, because from these commodity industries, what we have is the idea that an 8-week program for something is the same as a practice. That, for example, preparing to do your first marathon or something like this and running is the same as a practice. Or the idea that, for example, just trying to cut a certain amount of weight or put a certain amount of weight on or something like this, or change your physical constitution, that this is a practice. They're not practices. They're not practices. You cannot practice anything in any depth in 8 weeks. You cannot practice any depth of anything in 3 months. In 6 months, you've barely even looked into what this actual thing is. At 1 year, like I said, you might be able to say, okay, I've dabbled with that a little bit. But for me, 3 years is a minimum baseline for you to be able to say that, okay, I have a grounding in here a little bit, I'm negotiating this, and I am starting to make some headway and can see some options ahead of me of where I could go. Am I playing classical guitar? Am I more interested in being part of a band? Do I want to actually perform, or do I just want to do this for myself? You really need that 3-year initial to get into that. And one nice parallel here that we can think about is also the idea, and this helps with relating specifically to training, is the idea of the Olympic cycle. So the Olympic cycle, of course, is 4 years, right? So these phenomenal athletic individuals, they give themselves 4 years to prepare for the ultimate competition, and they practice. So surely if these elite level athletes spend 4 years just preparing for one competition, for one day, for one time on a schedule, to lift one weight, the right weight at the right time. If they prepare 4 years for that, how can we possibly say that much less than that time establishes an entire practice? Think about that for a minute. The other stereotypical, the other cliche we can take, which it's been said by Bill Gates, but obviously by many other people as well. And I send this more towards the optimistic light, because I understand, for some people who aren't so invested in the practice by now, it might be like, oh, I don't mean to be like that. But, it's often said, this cliche, that people significantly overestimate what they can achieve in 1 year, and significantly underestimate what they can achieve in 3 to 5 years. So, if you're engaging with a physical practice, whatever it is, but specifically, of course, if it's anything related with the work that I produce and I present, if you're following a daily practice program, if you're following any of the Elements programs, or if you're working with me one-to-one, if you have not been practicing for a period of, longer than that year, like 2 years, 3 years, I would reserve certain questions that you have with regards to how long it takes until that point. And there's a danger here, because, of course, the response from the individual might be like, okay, what? So I just have to keep practicing, quote unquote, in the dark until I get to that point and something magic happens? No, it's not at all. Because what will actually happen in that process is simply that those questions will disintegrate before your eyes. They'll just disappear if you continually practice. Because you start to realize that it's just a part of the brain, which can be unhelpful as it is when it comes to movement practice. It's just a part of the brain, a part of doubt, which simply stems from the fact that you don't have the experience in order to say anything different. And this is really the paradox. it's very difficult to really understand the question of how long it takes. Not only doesn't matter, but is problematic to a practice. We can only understand that once we've already put the practice in. So I hope that this gives some value or some insight, or hopefully doesn't get you down about that, I have loads of many more years of practice. This is something to rejoice about. This is something to think about, and it's like the anti-library, right? You have all these books that you haven't read, and rather than thinking, oh my God, I'm just collecting these books. Look at those books and go, wow, man, I have so much more that I can learn. This is fantastic, right? This is the other perspective. So take this into your individual perspectives, and if you're in this place where you've just been practicing a few months, 6 months, a year, or a couple years with something, just keep practicing. Just keep doing what you're doing. If you've made it that far, all you need to do is repeat what you've already been doing. Just repeat it. Of course, on the minutiae level, on the programming level, on the specific level, and things like this, we need to have these things locked in order to ensure that it's created in a sensible way that progress is being made. It's not the case that, just do anything and after time you get better at it. Of course, you can invest in things that aren't so great, and the returns on them are very, very minimal, if not negligible, if not negative over the accumulated time. So this just comes down to the material and the practice that you're following. But taking that into your practice, into your own perspective, is something that will help serve you all across the board, not just in your physical movement practice, but as a practitioner in general.